Welcome to The Explainer. Okay, today we are diving into a big one. Seriously, one of the most influential and, for sure, one of the most controversial books ever written. Karl Marx's Das Kapital. Now, I know, it's famously complex, right? But its ideas, well, they literally redrew the map of the world. So we're going to break down exactly how and why.
So, let's start with a question. A question that honestly feels like it could have been written yesterday, not back in the 19th century. Amid all these houses, why is there no home for me? I mean, wow. That simple, powerful line, it gets right to the very core of what Marx was trying to figure out. How is it possible that in a world with so much wealth, so much stuff being made, that so many people still have next to nothing? And get this wasn't just some dusty old economic textbook. No way. The ideas in this book were considered so dangerous, so explosive, that for decades, in some parts of the world, just owning a copy could get you thrown in jail. It was a crime. So what on earth was inside these pages that was so revolutionary? Well, to figure that out, we really have to start with the man himself. So, Section 1, The Surprising Karl Marx. Now, when you think of the guy who wrote the book on revolution, what do you picture? Probably someone from the working class, right? Someone who experienced oppression firsthand? Well, the real Karl Marx, he's going to surprise you. For starters, forget any ideas about a life of poverty. Marx was born into a pretty well-off, upper-middle-class family. His dad was a successful lawyer, which meant Karl had a very comfortable, privileged childhood and got a fantastic education. And it doesn't stop there. His personal life wasn't exactly the story of a working-class hero, either. He fell in love with and married a noblewoman, Jenny von Westphalen, who was literally part of the Prussian aristocracy. Now, it was a real love story, but you can't ignore the fact that it put him right in the middle of elite society. Okay, but this next part, this is where the irony just gets wild. The man who would become capitalism's #1 critic, he came from a family of entrepreneurs. In fact, in a crazy twist of history, his mother's family, the Philips family, would later go on to found, you guessed it, Philips, the giant electronics corporation. You just can't make this stuff up. But, despite this very comfortable background, Marx was a rebel from day one. He got to university and was way more into poetry and drinking clubs than his actual studies. He was even the vice president of a tavern club for a while. But then he started writing these really sharp, critical articles attacking the government. And, well, that got him in serious trouble. He ended up on a blacklist, and just like that, any hope of a normal academic career was gone. So, his rebellious spirit, with no place to go in the academic world, was about to find its true purpose. He moved to Paris, and he landed there just in time to see an event that would change his life and the world forever. The year is 1848, and Marx is in Paris. He's not just reading about the revolution, he's in it. He's right there in the streets, feeling the electricity in the air as everyday people, workers, citizens, build barricades and fight to take down the monarchy. I mean, imagine the hope of that moment, the feeling that ordinary people could actually change the world. But then, it all came crashing down. The hope just evaporated. The movement fell apart. The old powers came roaring back. And in what must have felt like a terrible joke, France didn't just fail to move forward, it actually went backward. It ended up with an emperor all over again. The dream was dead. And seeing this total collapse, it sparked the one question that would drive him for the rest of his life. Why? Why do these movements fail, even when millions of people want them to succeed? He realized it wasn't enough to just want change. It wasn't even enough to fight for it. He knew he had to figure out what the hidden forces were, the deep underlying rules of the game that always seemed to snap society back into place. So now we're forging an answer in London. Kicked out of Paris for his revolutionary work, Marx ends up in London. And this was the perfect place for him to be. It was the absolute heart of the global industrial economy. If he was going to find his answer anywhere, it was going to be here. And so his mission changed. He decided he needed a cool head, not just a hot revolutionary heart. He basically traded the street barricades for a library desk at the British Museum. And for the next 30 years, think about that, he spent almost every single day just buried in books, reading economic reports, government documents, anything he could get his hands on. He was going to build his case with cold, hard facts. And what he found in all that data was just staggering. It completely blew up the whole idea that this new industrial age was some great leap forward for everyone. Take working hours, for example. The average medieval farmer worked about 1,600 hours a year. Sounds like a lot, right? Well, the new industrial worker, they were putting in around 3,200 hours. Double. Progress was literally working people twice as hard. But some of the data he found was much, much worse. Just look at this number, 16. What is that? Well, in some of the toughest factory towns in England, 16 was the average age that a working-class child lived to. The average. They were sent to work as young as 6 in these brutal, dangerous conditions, and their lives were just over. For Marx, this wasn't progress. This was a human catastrophe.
All right, next up, history's secret engine. So after all these years, after decades buried in research, Marx believed he finally had it. He'd found the answer to that big question from Paris. He believed he had discovered the secret engine that drives all of human history. He called it historical materialism. Sounds complicated, but the core idea is actually pretty straightforward. It's this. If you want to understand a society, I'm talking its government, its laws, even its culture and religion, you have to start by looking at its economy. That's the key. Who owns everything and who's doing all the work? So here's a way to think about it, kind of like a building. Down at the bottom, you've got the foundation. He called this the economic base. This is all the stuff that makes things, the factories, the farms, the technology, and most importantly, the relationship between the people who own it all and the people who work there. Then, everything else in society, your government, your laws, your culture, your art, that's the superstructure. It's the rest of the building, and it's all built on top of that economic foundation. So his big radical point was this. You can't change the building by just repainting the walls. If you want real lasting change, you have to change the foundation. You have to change the economy. And that brings us to a world divided. So in 1867, after all that work, he finally did it. Marx published the first volume of Das Kapital. He put his entire theory, his whole critique of how the world works, out there for everyone to see. And things would never, ever be the same. Now, the book didn't explode overnight, but when it hit hard. 50 years after it was published, its ideas become a blueprint for the Russian Revolution in 1917. Before you know it, the entire planet is split in two. The Cold War begins, and it's a massive ideological showdown between capitalist countries and countries that built their entire systems on the ideas from this one book. And today, we're still debating the exact same issues he wrote about: inequality, work, and power. And its influence was just everywhere. It wasn't just about political revolutions. It completely shook up economics, sociology, and how we even think about history. It fueled social movements all over the world, labor unions fighting for rights, civil rights activists, even anti-colonial movements. The point is, it didn't matter if you loved his ideas or hated them. You couldn't ignore them. Which really brings us right back to today. Look, the giant political systems that were built in his name, they're mostly gone. But the questions that Marx asked in this book, they are still so incredibly relevant. So I'll leave you with this. As we all grapple with things like massive inequality, what the future of work looks like, and the incredible power that corporations have, how can we say we aren't still living with the very same questions he raised over 150 years ago?
Okay, today we are tackling a big one. We're going to crack open one of the most powerful, and let's be honest, controversial books ever written, Karl Marx's Kapital. So get ready, because we're going to cut through all the noise and get right to the core ideas that literally shook the world.
All right, let's dive right in. Before we even get into the nuts and bolts of capitalism, you've got to understand just how powerful Marx's words were. I mean, this wasn't some dry academic theory. No, this was a call to arms. It was basically an earthquake on paper.
And it all started with this one single line. Just think about it. A 29-year-old Marx writes this, and it kicks off a movement that would completely define the next 100 years. And you know what's crazy? It's from a simple little pamphlet. But these ideas, man, they spread like wildfire. They totally captured the imagination of millions of people.
And if you want proof of how much we still value these ideas, just look at this. A few years back, a single handwritten page, just one page from his original manuscript, went up for auction.
and it sold for over 150 million won. That's, what, more than 100,000 US dollars? For a single page. That just shows you the power of an idea that refuses to fade away.
Now, what's really fascinating is how Marx made his arguments. He had this famous rhetorical trick, this flip. He'd say, it's not A that determines B, it's B that determines A. So for him, it wasn't our consciousness, our ideas that shape our world. No, it was the other way around. Our material world, our economic conditions are what shape our thoughts. And this structure is so powerful. It was actually used later in one of the most famous speeches ever. Think JFK's "Ask not what your country can do for you."
So, why were his ideas so explosive? Well, it's because he claimed to have solved a huge mystery. To Marx, capitalism looked a lot like a grand magic trick, He saw all this immense wealth just appearing, seemingly out of nowhere, and he made it his mission to get on stage and show the audience exactly how the trick worked.
And his whole investigation, the entire thing, starts with one simple concept, the commodity. See, in a capitalist system, Marx argued that pretty much everything becomes a commodity. Not just stuff we need to survive, but things made for one reason and one reason only, to be bought and sold on the market. This is the tiny atom that the whole system is built on.
And here's where it gets interesting. Every single commodity has two sides to it, like a coin. Let's take a diamond. What's its use value? Well, it's kind of limited, right? It can cut glass, it looks pretty on a ring, but its exchange value? Whoa, that's massive. You could trade one tiny diamond for an entire house, and that huge gap, that disconnect between how useful something is and what it's worth, that was the mystery Marx was obsessed with solving.
Okay, so if value isn't just gonna how useful something is, then where in the world does profit actually come from? For Marx, the answer was hiding right there in plain sight. It was time to pull back the curtain and reveal the secret behind the trick.
And here's the big reveal. The secret ingredient is something he called surplus value. This is the absolute core of his argument. He said that profit is only created when a worker is paid less than the total value of the stuff they produce. That gap, that difference between the value they create and the wage they get, that's surplus value. And according to Marx, that's the hidden engine that powers all profit in capitalism.
Let's make this super simple. Think about a taxi driver. Let's say in one day she brings in 2.1 million won in fares for her company. Great day, right? But at the end of it, her paycheck is only 700,000 won. So where'd the other 1.4 million go? Well, that is the surplus value, and it goes straight into the pocket of the company's owner. See, the worker created the value, but the capitalist is the one who gets to keep the lion's share.
Okay, so this brings up a pretty obvious question, right? If the game seems kind of rigged, why on earth do workers agree to play it? I mean, why would anyone knowingly accept a wage that's less than the value they're actually creating?
Well, for Marx, the answer is brutally simple. They have no other choice. The average person doesn't own a factory or the expensive tools or the land, what he called the means of production. The only thing they truly have to sell is their own ability to work. So the choice isn't really between a good deal and a bad one. It's between a bad deal and starving.
And if you look back at history, it wasn't even presented as a choice. When capitalism was first taking off in places like England, they literally created laws to force people to work in factories. I mean, if you were unemployed and got caught begging, you could be whipped or branded with a hot iron. A third offense? That could get you executed. They actually made being jobless a crime.
Okay, but that was hundreds of years ago. Things are different now, right? We have other options. Can't we just, get smart and invest our way out of this dilemma? Play the stock market, buy some crypto, get into real estate.
Well, from a purely Marxist point of view, that's just a mirage in the desert. He would have argued that financial markets don't actually create any new value. He called it fictitious capital. All it does is shuffle existing money from one pocket to another. It's basically a giant high-stakes poker game where the players with the biggest stack of chips and the best information almost always win, not by creating something new, but by taking it from the other players. So, if the system is designed this way, what was Marx's solution? What's the way out? If you believe capitalism is fundamentally based on this surplus value trick, then what on earth is to be done? His answer wasn't a detailed blueprint, but a call to wake up. He really admired the story of the gladiator Spartacus, and for him, the very first step is just like Spartacus looking down and realizing, hey, I'm wearing chains. He believed that only when workers collectively recognize their situation can they even begin to think about changing.
And that leads to his most famous call to action, but one that gets misunderstood all the time. This wasn't just a call to, burn everything down. It was a call for solidarity. He truly believed that if working people came together, if they acted as one, they could build a totally new system, one where the value they create actually belongs to them.
And that really leaves us with a final lingering question. It's been over 150 years. The world today would be unrecognizable to Marx. But those core questions he asked, about work, about value, about who gets what, they haven't really gone away, have they? So you have to ask yourself, are his ideas just some relic from a history book? Or is it possible that the chains he was talking about just look a little different today?
Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to tackle a big one, maybe one of history's most influential and misunderstood thinkers, Karl Marx. We're going to unpack his analysis of capitalism, a critique that, for better or for worse, is still making waves in our world today. So let's just dive right in. To really get a handle on Marx, we kind of have to strip away all the political baggage and the complicated jargon that's built up over the last century and a half. We're just going to focus on the core principles that he actually laid out. All right, so at its absolute heart, the entire epic conflict between capitalism and communism, it really just boils down to one fundamental disagreement about ownership. And it's probably not what you're thinking. See, Marx wasn't talking about your personal stuff, your phone, your clothes, your car. Nope. He was focused specifically on the things a society uses to generate wealth, what he called the means of production. And here it is the crucial distinction. Under capitalism, individuals can privately own things like factories and land and so on. For Marx, that was the root of the whole problem. He basically argued that when a small group, let's call them the capitalists, owns all the tools, they will inevitably exploit the much, much larger group who has nothing to sell but their own ability to work. So what was his solution? Well, take these tools out of private hands and own them socially. In other words, they should belong to everyone. Okay, so this brings up a really interesting question. If we're all working, how do we decide what that work is actually worth? What makes one person's hour more valuable than someone else's? I mean, in our society, this seems pretty obvious, right? A doctor's hour of work gets paid a whole lot more than a cleaner's hour. And we mostly just accept that as the way things are. But Marx came along and posed a really radical challenge to that whole idea, asking a very simple question. Who decided this? And this right here gets to the core of his labor theory of value. From a purely human perspective, an hour of your life that you spend working is an hour you can never, ever get back. Doesn't matter if you're performing brain surgery or cleaning a floor. Marx's point was that in this very fundamental sense, every hour of human labor has an equal, intrinsic value. So who did decide one person's time is worth more? You might say supply and demand, or that some skills are just more valuable. But Marx saw those things not as laws of nature, but as man-made agreements. And it's those agreements that end up creating these vast inequalities in how we value each other's time. So if we follow that logic, this idea that an hour is an hour, how in the world would a communist society distribute all its resources? Well, this brings us to Marx's most famous and maybe most utopian slogan. From each according to his ability, to each according to his need. I know, it sounds like some far-off, abstract ideal, right? But what if I told you we actually see a version of this principle playing out in our everyday lives? Just think about a family. Parents don't give the most food to the kid who did the most chores that week. No, they give medicine to the child who's sick and food to the child who's hungry. It's all based on their needs. In Marx's perfect world, an entire society would function just like that, caring for all of its members. But, and this is a huge but, scaling that family model up to a global society with billions of people, well, that's where the beautiful ideal crashes right into some very messy human realities. Human psychology is just complicated. For instance, Did you know that research shows the mere presence of a first-class cabin on an airplane makes conflict among the passengers in economy more likely? It's not just about what you have, it's about the visible inequality. It's about seeing what other people have that you don't. And that creates very real social tension. Or listen to this story about the famous cellist Mstislav Rostropovich. He said that back in the Soviet Union, his amazing talent was celebrated as a gift to the entire community. But when he came to the West, even though he earned way more money, his success suddenly became a target for jealousy and envy. And he said he felt like he couldn't perform as freely because what was once a shared joy had been turned into a source of social friction. Now, in a Marxist analysis, this kind of social friction isn't some accident. It's a feature of the system. The argument is that the system maintains its power by stopping the majority of people from recognizing their common interests, by constantly creating divisions among them. I mean, just think about it. We see conflict between full-time employees and contract workers, right? Between people with college degrees and those without. Between folks in the city and folks in the country. Between men and women and between different generations. By pitting all these groups against each other, the potential for a unified movement that demands real systemic change is just constantly being undermined. Okay, so if the major communist revolutions of the 20th century failed to create this paradise and were often, let's be honest, brutal and oppressive, does that just mean Marx was flat out wrong? Was the whole project just a failure? Well, maybe we need to reframe the question. Instead of seeing communism as this finished story of failure, what if we look at it as part of a much longer, ongoing historical process? To put it in perspective for you, it took Christianity about 300 years to become the dominant religion of the Roman Empire. Marx's ideas have only been around for about half that time. So if you look at it from that viewpoint, the revolutions of the 20th century might not have been the final act at all, but maybe just the opening chapter. And this is exactly why it all still matters today. If you look at so many of the social and political protests happening around the world, on the surface, you might see a specific political target. But so often, what's really fueling them is a deeper frustration with economic inequality, and this feeling that the whole system is fundamentally unfair. So in the end, whether you see Marx's vision as a blueprint for utopia or a recipe for disaster, the core questions he raised, questions about fairness, about the value of our work, and about the power structures that shape our lives, well, they are just as relevant today as they were 150 years ago, and they're still driving debate and conflict all around us.